Hello, I'm Jackie Leonard, and after the news summary, we'll be putting listeners' questions about the COVID-19 outbreak to our own panel of BBC experts. You sent in your questions by email, Facebook and Twitter. You asked about the coronavirus itself, just how serious it really is, what we're learning from it, what's needed to contain and avoid it, its impact on our global economy and on politics in China. We'll talk about misinformation and what people are doing to cope with quarantine. All that after this.
BBC News with David Austin. There's been a sharp rise in the number of coronavirus cases in Iran as it emerged that an advisor to the country's supreme leader has died of the disease. Officials say they've confirmed more than 500 new cases, up from about 1,000 on Sunday. They say the number of deaths has risen to 66. The European Union's Disease Prevention Agency has raised the risk level from coronavirus to moderate to high. A special response team has been set up to coordinate efforts in dealing with the crisis. The EU said 18 member countries will work together to buy protective equipment. Stock markets around the world have stabilized after central banks moved to shield markets from the effects of the coronavirus outbreak. The Bank of England and the Bank of Japan followed the US Federal Reserve in promising to take steps to protect financial stability. Gunmen in northwest Nigeria have killed dozens of people during attacks on remote villages. The violence is not thought to be linked to Islamist militants. Correspondents say it's the latest violence and evidence of widespread insecurity in Nigeria. As Israelis vote in their third general election in a year, the President, Reuven Rivlin, has condemned the campaign as shameful. Mr. Rivlin said Israelis deserved a functioning government. The Indian Parliament has been adjourned following scuffles between MPs over last week's communal violence that left 46 people dead. Politicians are reported to have begun pushing and shoving each other after the Speaker refused to allow debate about the riots. A hostage drama at a shopping centre in the Philippines has ended peacefully after 10 hours. A disgruntled security guard with a gun had been holding about 30 people, but the hostages have now been led to safety. The gunman told reporters he was angry that his security firm had failed to address his grievances about working conditions. BBC News.
Hello, I'm Jackie Leonard. It was in December in the city of Wuhan, Hubei province in China, that doctors noticed a cluster of cases of a respiratory illness. Dr. Li Wenliang sent a message to fellow medics about the outbreak, advising they take precautions like wearing protective clothing to avoid infection. The police paid him a visit and told him to stop. He was one of 8 people who police said were being investigated for spreading rumours. He subsequently caught the virus from a patient and died, aged 34. To further complicate matters, Lunar New Year celebrations were getting underway when the seriousness of this new strain began to become apparent, a time when hundreds of millions of people would be travelling. First, the city of Wuhan was put into lockdown with businesses, schools and public transport closed. Nevertheless, it had spread to other cities, first inside China, and then, within a couple of months, cases were being picked up in more than 40 countries, with South Korea, Iran and Italy particular hotspots. So, you have been sending in your questions about how the virus works, the best way to avoid infection, its impact on politics and economics, and much more besides. And we will try to get to as many as we can. Let us begin by introducing the panel. Cindy Sue.
Hi, I'm a Taiwan correspondent for the BBC.
Stephen McDonnell.
Hello, I'm one of the Beijing correspondents for the BBC, and I'm on a bus. If you hear this grumble, 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 it's because we're out doing a bit of a government-organised tour of some factories where they're showing us things are slowly returning to normal. We've just left 2 places. I'm actually heading back to the bureau, so broom, 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 here we go.
And Celia Hatton.
Hi, I'm the BBC's Asia Pacific editor for the World Service, and I was a long-time China correspondent as well.
Vincent Nee.
Hi, I work for the World Service, cover China. I just use some hand gel given by Jackie.
Katie Prescott.
I'm a correspondent in the BBC's Economics and Business Unit.
Kerry Allen.
I'm a China media analyst at BBC Monitoring, which means I look at newspapers, social media that are coming out of China.
And last but definitely not least, James Gallagher.
I'm from the BBC's Health and Science team, and I neither have hand wash, I feel missed out,
there you
and
go.
I'm not on a bus.
you get on with the hand gel.
Thank you.
Right, while you get on with sanitising your hands, let us get to the first of the questions, starting at the very beginning.
Evan Slater in Boston, Massachusetts. Where did this virus come from?
Now, there are various theories, from a wet market in Wuhan to bats There is one other very interesting theory that came from a listener in New Zealand.
Hi guys. I heard that this particular coronavirus came from a meteorite that hit China last year. Is it true that most viruses come from space?
Okay, James is Mr. Science and he's currently rolling about laughing.
I've been asked so many questions in my career. That's the best yet. It has not come from space. Our best understanding of where this virus has come from is by basically doing the equivalent of a paternity test. So if you don't know who's that child's dad, you test the DNA and you look at the rest of the family. You do that with this virus, and it looks very closely related to a coronavirus that exists in bats. So the prevailing theory is that this was a bat coronavirus sometime in the past 100 years or so, and it has then infected another animal, briefly into another animal, and then into humans, and that's how you get the connection with all the live animals that would have been sold at that wet market in Wuhan.
Right, now let's look a little bit at the impact that it has on people.
Good day, my name is Kelly. I am from the USA, living in Bavaria, Germany. My question about the coronavirus is whether it doesn't sort of discriminate according to the host's health status, if it can be very serious and cause death in people of all ages and all health statuses.
And Mark W. Mitchell in Vancouver, Canada, wanted to know about the impact on expectant mothers and their fetuses.
Okay, so in terms of who is going to get infected, it seems to infect everybody universally. So there's no age group or gender or special at-risk person who's more likely to catch the virus. But you do notice differences once people have the infection. So the older you are, the more likely you are to have very severe disease, and the more likely it is to become a fatal infection. And the more pre-existing medical conditions you have. So if you already have lung problems from a lifetime of smoking, or you have type 2 diabetes, or you've got a heart condition, all those things increase your risk of this being a more dangerous infection for you personally, and again increase your risk of dying from it. In terms of expectant mothers, we don't really know yet what the impact is. Remember, if you have a 9-month pregnancy, this is an outbreak that's lasted 1 trimester of that so far, but we have heard some cases of young children, so days old, being infected in the hospital after they've been born. But what is reassuring so far is that for the very, very young, this virus doesn't seem to be that big a problem.
Now, there have been a couple of questions as well that sort of impact on economic outcomes as well as health.
This is Rob from Johannesburg in South Africa. I work in the freight industry and have had a number of clients inquire about the risk of contamination via parcels shipped internationally.
And Yuriko has the same concern. She runs a women's wear outlet here in London, but she imports clothing from China. And she's concerned about whether the virus might be still alive, it might still be on fabric and objects that are being imported, exported. We've got this sort of global supply chain thing going on. This has got to have an impact.
Absolutely. And we're starting to see clothing manufacturers saying that they're concerned about shortages of their products. China is, of course, the world's factory, and so companies that are dealing with China, and there are so many, even if your company doesn't deal directly with China, there's probably someone in your supply chain that does. And it's quite difficult for them to shift their supply chains quickly to other countries. In terms of the effect on the products and the living of the virus in fabric, I'm afraid I'm going to have to hand over to James.
Probably not really an issue. There are some viruses, so something like norovirus, gives you hideous diarrhea and vomiting, I can tell from personal experience.
Thank you.
But that can survive like 6 months outside of the human body. But the way this virus seems to be built, the anticipation is its days. So if you're ordering something from China, by the time it has arrived at your doorstep, nothing is going to survive.
And Kerry, you monitor all the media outlets and social media around China. There must be concerns about employment.
Yes, there have been a lot of people working from home, particularly because children haven't returned to schools. People are being told that when they do return to work, they have to, in some companies, stay at least a metre apart from each other, not eat together, set up cardboard between each other, not exactly back to work as usual.
Now, we hear that most people do actually recover from this virus, and we had a message via Facebook. Otabo Ohano says, influenza kills more people than coronavirus, so are we making too much of a fuss? Edmund Cohen says it's being hyped as if it were the Black Death, while flu is hospitalising and killing way more people. Are we overreacting? James?
It's hard to make the comparison with flu because flu is in every country all the time, whereas this is something that if you can contain it, you can nip it in the bud. And so you can only really compare the global threat from both as if this coronavirus had actually spread around the world and was in every country. And that's a scenario that is looking increasingly hard to prevent, but it's something that could have been prevented. And that's why there's been so much attention to it. I mean, you can't ignore the fact that China shut down and 60, 70 million people, the equivalent population to the whole of the UK in quarantine. It's been an incredible response.
And what do you think might be the repercussions from this, Vincent?
First of all, the reason why there's so much mixed response from China and outside of China is really because we don't know much about the nature of this virus, because everyone is so scared, including the government in China is quite worried to what extent this will affect the entire population. These days, the presence of Chinese economy is everywhere. China accounts to about 70% of the global economy. We also talk about tourism industry that is really, really hardest hit. And the one big concern in China is that because of the massive scale of lockdown, we'll see China's GDP going perhaps on the brink of recession.
You were trying to chip in there, Celia.
Yeah, I mean, I think one really interesting topic of conversation that's come out of this is, a lot of praise for China in many ways. Many people around the world saying, oh, if this virus had broken out in any other country, they wouldn't have been able to lock down people the way that China has. Though I do think we have to note that when the government really swung into action and put a lot of virus restriction measures in place, it kind of froze China in time. So wherever you were located at that time, if you were far away from your family, maybe you were away from your children, if you're a medical worker who's had to go and deal with this virus, you've been away from your family for quite some time. There have been a lot of really heartbreaking videos of kids who are sobbing because they can't go outside, children who are sobbing because they haven't seen mommy or daddy in a really long time.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, there was one particularly terrible story of a little boy in exactly this sort of situation. His parents are migrant workers, off in another place working, couldn't get back to Wuhan. He was living with his grandfather who died. He stayed in the flat with his grandfather who'd passed away. He just put a sheet over him and sat there and ate biscuits for days until somebody came and knocked on the door. One of the social workers said, well, why didn't you ask for help? He said, oh, my granddad said don't go outside because it's dangerous, I'll get the coronavirus.
We're also hearing about some of the less savoury sides of human nature.
This is Coffee from China, not Hubei province. I have a story of my best friend who is currently studying abroad in the University of Manchester, UK. She told me that she was sort of forced not to wear masks when she went out because Chinese students wearing masks are very likely to be excluded or even bullied.
So that's a story of bullying right here in the UK. And Cindy, you have heard more of stories like that, haven't you?
Yes, including from my own mother in California, who's been living in the U.S. for decades. She told me that she was quite upset recently when she was waiting to pay for her groceries at a supermarket. And the lady in front of her told her to take several steps back to keep a distance. She wasn't wearing a face mask. She was healthy, and she was quite put off by that. Thank goodness the cashier was quite apologetic and sympathetic towards her. It just speaks to how much we really need to understand the science behind it so that people are not prone to act out of fear and discriminate against each other.
What's incredible about this story, it's unlike a lot of other news stories because it can suddenly morph from being something that's on the other side of the world, perceptibly, and then it's amazing how quickly it spread and how quickly the fear spreads. I have a child who attends a school in central London. It's a primary school, and I was sent a message from one of the other parents at the school, and it's a conversation between a parent and a kid, and the parent said, "How was school?" And the kid says, "Great, we played coronavirus." And the parent says, "What's that?" And the kid says, "You breathe on people and they have to be locked in the zone," that's the climbing frame at the school playground, "for the rest of lunchtime with no human rights." I mean, it's funny, but it's also kind of heartbreaking that this is the case. And, my child is ethnically half Chinese, and children who look Chinese or frankly who look of any Asian ethnicity are being shunned in a lot of schools around the world right now. This is a real problem.
Just a reminder that you are listening to the Global News Podcast Coronavirus Special with our guests Cindy Su in Taipei, Stephen McDonnell on a bus in Beijing, Celia Hatton is here, she is the Asia Pacific editor, Vincent Nee from the BBC World Service who covers Chinese stories, Katie Prescott is here and across all business and travel for us, Kerry Allen is from BBC Monitoring, and James Gallagher is our health and science correspondent. Now, where there is a vacuum of trusted information, there is, as we've heard, quite a lot of conspiracy and hoax and misinformation. Listener Jim Glade in Colombia emailed in and he said, well, what's the extent and effectiveness of online misinformation targeting populations affected by the coronavirus? Nagesh Shetty in India was receiving WhatsApp messages warning about the strains that were going to be put on the medicines industry in India as a result of the virus, and why asks, can we trust official Chinese figures? Is there a scientific way to estimate accurately? So information and misinformation, Kerry, it's really easy for people with malintentions to spread misinformation, isn't it?
Especially if they've got nothing better to do and they're stuck at home, which is the case at the moment. And China has more than 800 million internet users. So there's been a lot of information going online. Some of the things we've seen, for example, videos suggesting that medical workers have been shooting people on the streets of Hubei, and it turns out, no, it's not. It's footage from a police official shooting a rabid dog that's been stitched together with audio and footage from a car accident a number of months ago. The government has been telling people that they should listen to the official channels, so People's Daily and CCTV. At the same time, there have been resident journalists within Wuhan, this clash between locals within Hubei trying to tell the real story and what the central government wants people to believe. We know two cases, a man called Fang Bin and another journalist called Chen Chuoshi, both of whom were going out onto the streets of Hubei province and live streaming and saying, we're trying to tell the real story, and they've gone missing and we don't know what's happened to them.
Let us head back to the impact of the virus on people. Betsy Espinosa Vilches in Mexico City says that there's been a lot of information about the numbers of people infected and people dying, but there's not a lot of information about the people who recovered. Robin Cho in the US wants to know, do patients who recover become immune to the virus in the future? And via Facebook, Jolie Chung asked, conversely, if you've got this virus, are you likely to suffer permanent damage from it? So, James, let's just get some answers from you on those.
Even though we have tens of thousands of cases, what we don't know is whether those people are going to survive or die yet in a lot of things, because it can take 2 to 3 weeks between your symptoms first appearing and reaching the end of the disease process. So it's going to take time before you can tick people off and say, no, you've definitely 100% recovered. And that's why the recovery figures are lagging behind. And you also need to have confirmatory tests to make sure that you're clear of the virus. The other question was about whether you're immune. We don't know for certain yet. So some viruses, if you're infected with them, that's you sorted for life. You'll never catch it again. Some you can catch the same virus twice in the same winter. So the immune system has a varying memory depending on which virus it's infected with. So we don't know how long the coronavirus immunity would last. We'd expect something at least in the short term, but is that weeks, months, years, a lifetime? We don't know the answer to that yet.
There have been so many travel questions from listeners, like Waka Sato wondering about the Tokyo Olympics. Others have been planning trips to Vietnam, Thailand, Brazil, the Euro football tournament, and just travel more generally. And it's a really difficult thing to provide answers for. Katie, first of all.
A lot of this comes down to what the guidance is from your own government about where you can travel. And that will depend on whether your insurance will cover you. So, for example, if your government says, look, we advise against travel to Tokyo, for example, in the next few months, then it's likely your travel insurance will kick in and you'll get money back for your flights. A number of airlines are saying, particularly for flights to China and Italy, that they've set a period whereby you can change or get refunds for those flights. But I'm afraid it really is a sort of wait and see at the moment.
Well, economics, of course, feeds into politics. And let's get some more questions from our listeners.
My name is J.D. Dice in the state of Arizona, the United States. I wanted to ask the experts if they thought that there would see some reluctance, if not just flat-out inability of the Communist Party in China to be able to ratchet back the level of control that they've gotten to in order to control the COVID-19 outbreak.
Hi, my name is Carol and I live in Cape Town in South Africa. One of my interests regarding the coronavirus is the potential impact on China, both socially and politically, in future. I spent a week in China 3 years ago, and I was particularly struck by the amount of surveillance and the prominence of the police and a feeling of being in a police state, particularly coming from South Africa, where we fought very hard for our freedom.
And Patrick from Philadelphia has a similar question. Officials have been fired, he says, and President Xi Jinping has been seen walking in public. Is there any chance for serious political change in China as a result of this outbreak and its handling by officials? Vincent?
Yeah, I've read quite a lot of op-eds talking about whether this is a watershed moment for China stepping into the world of democracy. I think in the mind of the Communist Party leaders in Beijing, democracy or not is never a question. I think the options for them is it's a harder or softer type of authoritarianism.
I think there's also a strong sense of embarrassment among Chinese people within China and also outside of China. China is supposed to be a rising power now. It's the second biggest economy in the world. The Chinese were feeling so proud of their country, how far it's come compared to the days of the 60s and 70s Cultural Revolution when they didn't have enough to eat. But now this virus that has affected the whole world, China's being blamed for it. That kind of shame is going to build up into some sort of public pressure for some kind of reform to prevent this from happening again.
Celia?
I think we have to also just go back to SARS in 2002 and then 2003. The big difference back then was that there wasn't really any social media platforms. People couldn't really discuss and analyze what was going on. And so I think that's something that the governments had to contend with this time. And the government promised back after SARS that they were going to put in a whistleblowing mechanism so that local medical officials, if they sensed that there was a new virus coming out, that they could put their hand up and alert the authorities right at the top and they would be listened to. Well, clearly that didn't work. Maybe this time we will see some real change in China in that respect.
Now let's get some more questions from our listeners who want to know about how we will move forward from this.
Hello, my name's Sian and I'm speaking from Tokyo in Japan. We get lots of updates on the statistics and geographical spread, but actually very little on the virus itself. What have we learnt from the 96% or more who have survived?
Hi, I'm Jackie Bricks from Deerwood, Minnesota, and I'm wondering if the plasma from the blood of survivors of coronavirus could help people that are currently fighting the infection. And if so, can we mass produce that if it were to become a pandemic?
So we want to know about what we can learn from the people who have recovered and how close we might be even perhaps to an effective vaccination. James?
What we've largely learned is that for the overwhelming majority of people, this is a mild disease. It might as well just be the common cold flu in terms of the symptoms it causes, and most people recover on their own. Your immune system will get on top of it. In terms of treatments, specifically on the thought of plasma, obviously if your immune system responds to an infection, then it starts producing antibodies. Now, in theory, you could take somebody's blood, take those antibodies out of it and give it to somebody else. That's quite complicated to do. You could attempt to manufacture those antibodies in the laboratory. That's incredibly expensive to do. So really, in terms of treatments, they're looking at other antiviral drugs rather than turning to the patients themselves. So this is drugs that will be used to treat other viral infections and trialing which of those actually work against this coronavirus. A vaccine is a completely different approach. So the vaccine is the search for a way of injecting something that looks a little bit like the virus into people, and that will trigger an immune reaction. So your body learns to identify the virus, starts producing those antibodies ahead of time. And then when you eventually become exposed to the coronavirus, then you've already had a head start, and then you should at least have lessened symptoms, if not complete immunity. Normally you talk about medical research taking at least a decade to get from concept to something that you can actually give to patients. The hope here is that a vaccine may be possible in 18 months or so. So the work started incredibly quickly. As soon as the coronavirus was genetically sequenced, its genetic code was published on the internet, that triggered the vaccine research. Some vaccines have already been tested in animals. We don't know how successful it's been yet. The hope is there'll be human trials by the end of the year. But the problem with that is that even if those human trials, say by November, December, prove that it's effective, it's one thing to have university research laboratory to hold up above their heads, I have the vaccine. It's a completely different thing to then be able to mass produce that and give it to lots of people, which is why all the vaccine talk really is of mid-2021, if not later.
And one final very pithy question from Facebook. Oscar Navarro says, When will it end?
Well, potentially it might never end because the virus could become what's known as endemic, which is where it just circulates all the time. And so that would be like 4 other coronaviruses that exist in the human race which cause the common cold. And that would potentially be the result if we don't manage to completely contain it.
And Stephen, I gather you're back in the Bureau. Do you have an answer for Oscar?
Yes, I am. Back in the Bureau, the never-ending virus. Oh, no, surely it's
Can I just say, I love the never-ending story reference, because my partner will never watch the never-ending story. It's a cornerstone of my childhood, and she's never watched it.
We were sitting around the other night. I'm sure people have been following this tandem story of the Wall Street Journal correspondents have been booted out of China in controversial circumstances, and a few of us were having drinks with them, wish them a bon voyage. And we were having this conversation of when on earth is our life going to be back to normal and what constitutes normal. So we're kind of having bets, actually. We thought, what should be the measure? Going into the pub without having your temperature taken was the decision in the end. How long will it take for us to be able to go to the pub and not have our temperature taken? Some people thought by May. I don't know. I think it could be July or something like that. I mean, a lot of people are holding out hope that the warmer weather is going to bring this to an end. But the trouble with that theory is, we've seen Singapore, and then, of course, you've got the Southern Hemisphere winter kicking in. So people from Argentina, Chile, Australia, South Africa could all get it and then start flying around the world again and keep the whole coronavirus palaver kicking on.
Yeah, mitigation will be really important if it does take off around the rest of the world. Just imagine, this is completely hypothetical, don't hold me up when my figures will be completely wrong, but say 1 million people in a country like the UK were to get the virus. If they all get it in 1 month, that's almost impossible for the healthcare system to deal with. If that 1 million people is stretched out over 12 months because you've managed to contain and delay the spread of it, the same number of people get infected. But actually, by spacing it out, mitigating it, it's what's known scientifically as flattening the curve, then that's easier for healthcare systems and hospitals and doctors to cope with, contain the virus.
So necessity is the mother of invention, and we have seen quite a lot of interesting responses to the virus and how people are trying to live with it. We've seen designer rubber boots at the Milan Fashion Week. We saw designer face masks in London, and masks being created that will allow facial recognition on your phone to still work. People are getting quite creative, aren't they, Kerry?
They're getting very creative. People being stuck indoors, promoting their businesses. There are some marathon runners we've seen who have been promoting the idea of people keeping fit by doing circuits around their coffee table and putting these online, and it's inspired others to actually do exercise where they normally wouldn't.
Cindy, what have you been seeing?
The elderly people in Taiwan have gone on the sewing machines, and they've made these face mask jackets, actually very cute, where you can slip your face mask through them and you don't have to change face masks that often. You just wash the jacket. And that's partly because we're limited by how many face masks we can buy. So, they're in short supply and everybody has to somehow make ends meet. In the end, I think maybe perhaps one good thing that might happen is there might be better hygienic practice and habits here.
Stephen, what sort of creativity have you been seeing?
One thing that has been remarkable, I mean, it's not remarkable for people who've been in China, but the humour trying to deal with this, people inside their quarantine at home playing games that they've invented, like someone will be sitting there with his fishing rod fishing inside the fish tank, or, people sort of doing air guitar with different bits and pieces of housing appliances. Really good, funny stuff. And it's also, I mean, apart from keeping themselves amused, just by seeing that, I think all the other people in quarantine think, we'll get through this. It's going to be okay. And even though it's terrible, people are, of course, sick and dying. It's really nice to see that spirit.
And that's it from us. Thank you to the panel: Katie Prescott, Cindy Sue, Stephen McDonnell, Celia Hatton, Kerry Allen, James Gallagher and Vincent Nee. Most of all, thank you for sending in so many excellent questions. If you would like to hear the extended version of this programme, you can download it. Go to wherever you normally get your podcasts. Look for the Global News Podcast Coronavirus Edition.